Hello and welcome to Semantic Reactions, the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. My name is Ben Hauk, and I'm pleased to be able to introduce the 30th installment in our ongoing series. For our February 2025 installment, IGS President Lance Strate interviews Gabriel Kennedy, aka Prop Anon, a writer, musician, and artist, and author of the recently published book, Perilous, The Life and Thought of Robert Anton Wilson. Naturally enough, their discussion deals with the life and work of Robert Anton Wilson and how he was greatly influenced by Alfred Korzybski and general semantics, as well as Gabriel Kennedy's background and career. Let's listen in.
Well, hello and welcome to another episode of Semantic Reactions, the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. I'm here with Gabriel Kennedy, aka Prop Anon. Which of these is your real name?
It's Gabriel.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, welcome, Gabriel.
Hi, Lance. Thank you for having me here today.
Well, it's great to have you, and great. And the reason for us doing this podcast is the publication of your new book, Perilous, The Life and Thought Crimes of Robert Anton Wilson. And we'll get to that soon, but let's start with you, Gabriel, and where are you from?
Sure. I was born and raised in Long Island, New York, roughly 23 miles from Brooklyn, where Robert Anton Wilson grew up. And I grew
Which
up.
town? Which
I
town?
grew up in Syosset.
Oh, okay.
If you know that place. Yeah,
It's a
nice
stop
place.
on the Long Island Railroad. I know that.
It is the stop on the Port Jeff line, on the Port Jefferson line. It was it was a pretty, I'd say it was a nice neighborhood. Fairly quiet there on the North Shore of Long Island. My parents were from Ireland, and so they originally settled in the Bronx, and then they were able to start a bar business out in Long Island, and that's what they did for pretty much the rest of their days. And so I had a unique sort of experience of that neighborhood because seeing through the eyes of barflies at times was like a really interesting kind of exposure to how people talk, and so I really enjoy stories and just listening to people. I think it comes from maybe something from there. And so I grew up not too far from New York City. So as a kid, the railroad was right there. I could walk to the train, like, a lot of places out there. And I would just basically go to Manhattan all the time in my teenage years, and eventually just really fell in love with the intellectual smorgasbord that exists in New York City and the Village and whatnot. And so I was always reading interesting and fun books, and I came across the work of Robert Anton Wilson in high school. And when a friend of mine handed me a copy of Illuminatus trilogy in the back of math class, and looking at the cover and reading the back cover, and then reading a couple quotes from the book, I was immediately hooked. I was like, "Whoa, I got to read this book. What's this about?" And I read that book in the summer of from high school to college, and it just inspired a real interest in learning so many things about Robert Anton Wilson. But along the way, though, of say writing this book, I became very involved in different music scenes in New York City and whatnot. And New York City has such a vibrant and great music scene. It's one of the epicenters of great music in the world. It was a real
Right.
privilege to just be around so many talented people, truly. and people you'll never even hear of, right? That's usually how the arts go, and um, really got to absorb so much, great music and meet so many great people, and that's where the moniker Prop Anon comes from.
Mhm.
I, just became involved in hip hop culture, and was a visual artist and like a DJ and an MC. Put out a couple of projects as Prop Anon as a rapper, and then I also um, was involved in like the hardcore music scene and punk rock and all this other rock music, because everything bleeds together in the New York City sort of underground. There's no real genre boundaries, especially not
Uh-huh.
anymore. But for especially when I was really involved in it, and that was what was so great. So for instance, you'd have MCA from the Beastie Boys. He would be playing bass at CBGBs for different hardcore groups. Like people all knew each other, so it was very easy to then make a sort of rock record, which I did. I put a band together called Hell Eris, and then we put out like the stoner doom metal project, which was a lot of fun, and that was called Hell Eris. And so,
Could you spell that just in case anyone wants to look into it who's listening?
of course, no problem. Sure, yeah, it's a Hail Hell Eris, Eris, and it's a reference to Discordianism,
Hmm.
and this sort of path of and this all happened really organically, Lance, like just falling into the music scene. It was really just from being a kid hanging out in the city all the time and meeting fun
Yeah.
people, and then you just do things, and it became a kind of music career unexpectedly in a way, and that lasted a number of years, about a decade. And but the whole time I was reading and writing and working on what would become this book, uh Chapel Perilous: The Life and Thought Crimes of Robert Anton Wilson, because Robert Anton Wilson became my favorite writer, and I obsessively read everything that he wrote multiple times and was always taking notes. Um, uh, it- because discovering his philosophical spine, his philosophical foundation, is what really inspired me to learn as much as I could about him. Because I realized, like, this guy is a serious philosopher. I don't care whether or not he's recognized by various academies, or we're not reading his books in philosophy class. Like, I was learning so much from him while I was reading his books in college, and contrasting that with the books I was being assigned in school, and it really helped me so much understand really in-depth sort of uh, jargonized uh, philosophy and scientific concepts. So Wilson was a great teacher for me, and everything just sort of happened organically, from the music to then learning more and more about Robert Anton Wilson, studying his stuff, and then eventually this book.
Well, you mentioning college. Where exactly were you going at that time?
I was going to Hofstra University.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I dropped out though. I
Uh-huh.
left. It was towards the very end too, but it just I just had to leave at that time. Yeah, it was not very wise to drop out. But what do they say about wisdom and youth? They don't always
Uh,
go together. So
yeah. Well, but certainly a lot of well-known people have done the same thing, especially if you're having success in show business, uh, in the arts, as well as people in the tech industry.
yeah, I was studying. I was in a an interesting college, called the New College, there on campus, and was its own a little sort of college unto itself. It was born out of in the late 60s, I heard at Hofstra, and the early 70s was actually a fairly radical campus. Students were fairly radicalized, and they they wanted a new college, another sort of college where students could have more of an interdisciplinary freedom and flow with the classes that they put together. So they offered some really amazing classes. One class was called the American Odyssey, where the professor took, I think it was about 8 of us, and we went cross country. It was in the year, I forget, it was, I think it was around, yeah. So we were able to, and she was an activist. So that was really interesting because we ended up going to all these sort of demonstrations, and we ended up at the Fort Benning in Georgia, where Father Bourgeois and Martin Sheen were leading a march crossing the line of Fort Benning, because it was there that the School of Americas was located, where South American death squads learned torture techniques, and where they also were trained, and they assassinated Archbishop Oscar de Romero. Um, so yeah, that was a pretty intense trip. We learned about all these things on this trip, and it was called the American Odyssey. And that was so Hofstra was very interesting. It just wasn't. I just eventually kind of just dropped out. But in the service of education, I went back to school, and I'm finishing my degree. So I'm happy to say that. Yes, I
Cool.
totally in support of university systems. It just, I think people should have the opportunity to go back later in life to, if they ever, because there's so much great stuff there. So, yeah, so I went back to school.
Well, kudos for that.
Thank you.
But to return to your foolish youth now, so when did you adopt the Prop Anon alias?
Um, that was very early on. When I left college, I went to Hawaii. And I was living fairly humble out there, just renting a room. And there was a local hip hop scene out in Hawaii that was really inspiring and really amazing. There was so many creative people out there, so many creative like young people. And Hawaii does not get a lot of opportunity to get heard on the mainland. So they're a part of America, but they really don't feel like, for many reasons, part of America. And one reason is that mainland American culture ignores, everyday Hawaiian people life, uh, because there's only the image of Hawaii as this paradise that we go on vacation to. But meanwhile, there's people every day working their butts off 2, 3 jobs just to survive and rent a room even out there, because it's very expensive now to live. And so, but you have all these young people out there who are super creative, and they'll eventually, maybe some of them, go to the mainland. But I didn't know all this, obviously, when I went out there, that there was even like a hip hop scene, and I was so happy to find that there was. And yeah, again, organic. Everything was just very organic. Like, it starts out with just a cipher, people standing around in a circle, someone doing a beatbox, making, the drum noises with their mouth, and then people just spontaneously freestyling, right? And that's really where it all started for me, in a cipher. And then watching people on stage and really being inspired by them and be like, yo, they're really good. Like, I want to do that. That looks awesome. Right. And that's what these scenes were like, I found, for me, especially again at Hawaii at that time. There was, of course, heavy competition, and there were kids that had, beef with each other, this and that. But there was still this overriding vessel of like support. I always equated it to like skateboarding, where kids skateboard pools and whatnot, or not just kids, people skateboard pools. And when someone does a cool trick, you applaud. You say, great job, because you know how difficult that is to pull that off, right? And I
Yeah.
found a lot of that in
Well, I
within
don't know, but I imagine so.
yes, for sure. Yeah. Yeah. So I found it that these music seems to be all very supportive, and in not in any way that people are supportive with words. It's just the fact that it's there and you can go do something that night. And if you don't have a lot of money, it was $5 or $10 or free, and you don't have to pay to freestyle all night, you know?
Uh,
So,
so
mhm.
what what why Prop Anon? Why did you choose that moniker?
Prop Anon is short for Propaganda Anonymous.
Hmm.
And I actually, Propaganda Anonymous is sort of an artistic, philosophical approach, basically, of looking at the world as it is right now, like how media and propaganda is hurled at us from increasingly more anonymous sources, meaning we are told messaging, via the internet or radio or whatever, but especially the internet. And we have the impression of where we really don't know where it's coming from, because there are so many covers or fakes, or for instance, a lot of ballot initiatives, especially out here in California right now. There'll be Prop 161, which is
Hmm.
saying like, we want to use blue pens in the office this spring. And then there's Prop 162, which makes it seem like those who want to get rid of the blue pens, are actually, they want even more blue pens. So adding confusion in voters' minds as to what they really want to vote for, what they really want. Um, I mean, any type of misinformation or propaganda, that is put out there, we increasingly may not be able to trace the origin or the source, because we may think it's coming from one source, but if we dig a little deeper, it was actually some other source deceiving, which is part of the sort of misinformation campaign, right? So, or another, for instance, is, and this is a very controversial one, the notion of RussiaGate. Um,
Hmm.
was Trump, and is Trump, a little minion of Putin? Um, there are those who are completely convinced that yes, it's true. Daniel Steele dossier is real. Christopher Steele dossier is real, et cetera, et cetera. Um, Everything leads to Putin. And then there are those who believe otherwise, and they believe they're looking at the facts, et cetera, et cetera.
Hmm.
But there are definitely encampments, there are definitely organizations that want you to believe what they're saying
Right.
without you critically analyzing it and thinking about it for yourself. So that's the whole point of Propaganda Anonymous, is to just take a second, center yourself as you're ingesting all this media and people trying to, grab your attention and then capture it and use you as another propaganda tool, for another mouthpiece for their ideology or
Right.
product, if you will.
It
So
sounds like what you're referring to is in what we call in general semantics a semantic pause, right? That take that moment to reflect and critically analyze what is going on.
I think that's a great way to put it. Yes, I completely that. And it was Propaganda Anonymous coming up with that sort of idea or approach. It was completely, well, very much influenced by, say, Robert Anton Wilson, and then
Mhm.
indirectly general semantics, um, and also Noam Chomsky's and Edward Herman's propaganda model, uh,
Mhm.
that they put out in their book Manufacturing Consent. For a very long time, I was very interested in this whole notion of propaganda, because uh, I mean, that's something I observed early in life, that there are, as I just said, like organizations or groups that, specifically young people too, they want young people to just echo exactly what they tell them to say, instead of seeking to help them learn how to create their own voice to reflect where they are. Because, you know, as Korzybski said, every individual being is a unique phenomenon. So
Mhm.
uh, we need to develop our voice to be able to express that to the world, because we all need to hear these different points of view in order to gain a better understanding of the present moment. And I I believe in this, and I agree with Korzybski, and I agree with Bob,
Yeah.
but maybe I'm just a tool of their propaganda. I don't know.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that the term propaganda and the concept figures so much with what you've been doing, because you go back to the origins of general semantics, and at least in part, it parallels a lot of other interests that come up after World War One, where there was a real feeling that we were propagandized, and in that case, by the folks that we're most sympathetic to, the British and the French, and that we had gotten involved in World War One. It was a lot like Vietnam, where we reflected back on it, and we really didn't know why we were involved in it at all. It was just battles between different empires and not about democracy. So in the aftermath, of course, Korzybski develops general semantics, and starts up the Institute of General Semantics. And there was also another institute that was founded around the same time, which was the Institute of Propaganda Analysis, which is no longer around, whereas the IGS were still going strong. But it also coincides with the rise of modern advertising and public relations, going back to the 20s, and that also um, was a reason for folks to be concerned with mass persuasion and mass communication. So very fitting that that this is your adopted alias. So I mean, maybe to go back to just your story then. So you're in Hawaii, you get into the rap scene there, and is that when you started to record, or did you then move back to New York, or out to California? How did that work out?
Before Hawaii, I was involved in the New York City sort of hip hop and drum and bass, I guess, scene and whatnot. Um, but going to Hawaii, something clicked even more, and the emceeing became more of a thing. So it was there. I believe, yes, I recorded my first tracks, songs there in Hawaii. Formed, a little, like, a hip hop group. We're called Lowest Common Denominator,
Hmm.
and and that was a awesome collection of people, man. Like, there was me, and then my friend. His mom was, or is, I think she's from Standing Rock. So no, she's Navajo. She's Navajo. So she was part of the American Indian movement when she was younger. And then so, like, he there, and then so he had stories that she would tell him, and he would tell me. And then we had another, uh his cousin was, his dad was a Black Panther, and he ended up in Hawaii. And then like, we recruited some more people, and I mean, I was just blown away. I thought everyone was really cool, and I just loved being out in Hawaii, and then having engaging with, it felt like a real-time engagement with living culture now. It wasn't a mediated. Unfortunately, sadly, people will go to places like Hawaii, and they'll have these very mediated experiences, whether through tour packages or hotels, rent cars, and this and that. And, the best thing to do always is to get off the beaten track, if you will, and really engage with the culture there. And, I plugged in with the hip hop scene, and it was really great. And then at that time as well, there was this idea of underground hip hop. So, uh, that there was a network, that Hawaii could be connected to New York through this, and LA, and a tour network, was mind blowing to me. And that tour network was there, and was also still developing. So artists would come in from California and perform. And then I, my family being in New York, my father passed away, and so I went back to New York for a little while. while still having kind of, stuff going on in Hawaii. So I eventually went back to Hawaii. But when I was in New York, I plugged in to the New York hip hop scene there, and then kind of uh, met up with a crew, with a really fun group of individuals. They were called Mind Spray, the Mind Spray crew out in Brooklyn. Shout out to them. And yeah, they were dynamic artists, people who were making stuff happen in a scene where people were making things happen. Like, as they say, like, do it yourself. Like, that was a huge ethos. This is for me,
Mhm.
what I received from the elders and the music scenes. Like, you got an extra nod of respect, an extra stripe on your shoulder if it was DIY. It wasn't astroturfed by some anonymous funder or group, or how did he or she get up on stage? They're not good. Oh, so and so paid for the tickets. Oh, I see now. Like, there was none of that. You had to get up there through your own merit. You had to prove yourself. And there was intense competition, so I really enjoyed that. But it was really inspiring competition. At the end of the day, people supported each other for the most part. And so that went on for a number of years. As I said, I did things with Mind Spray. We toured a little bit, uh, and then I went back to New York, um, and was back there for a while, many years, and then I started doing sort of solo projects as Propaganda Anonymous or Prop Anon, and I
Mhm.
put out an EP and an album. I did a few tours. Um, kind of with hip hop groups and punk rock groups. I did yeah, that was really, really fun. And then toured out in Europe uh, a little bit, and got to connect with awesome people out there making really, really interesting music. And and then I was writing for online publications, like Mondo 2000, Reality Sandwich, and some of my own stuff. I was involved in Robert Anton Wilson's online, uh, uh, what do you call it? School, basically, called the Maybe Logic Academy, which
Mhm.
was a remote asynchronous learning hub that pretty much has the same exact format that's being instituted all these years later in colleges and universities during COVID. And if you're a remote student, it's still kind of the same structure of weekly modules,
Right.
forums, discussion areas. And it was amazing. It was
So a lot of what we did during COVID was Zoom based rather than
true. They
rather
did
than
not have that yet. Sorry. Yeah.
that. But that was the original way of doing it, the distance education through email uh, kind of approach.
100%. There was,
And we still do that with IGS. We Mary Lehman's been doing online courses. There's actually Mary Lehman has an online thought and language and thought course that is actually going on as we speak.
that's great to learn. That's great to hear, Lance. Yeah, it was, I mean, Bob, when I really looked at his work, he's a general semanticist all the way
Mhm.
through, truly. Um,
Yeah.
it was that much of an influence, I'd say. And the Maybe Logic Academy were, there were courses that first centered around Wilson and his work. So one course was focused on Illuminatus trilogy. Each book sort of received a course. Um, he would go into what he called non-Euclidean politics, which was his sort of take on what he wished the world lived in, a sort of political state like that. Uh, what he called like a non-zero or non-zero sum game situation. But then they also brought in other teachers, and they were basically writers as well. So Douglas Rushkoff taught a number of classes there. David
Yeah.
J. Brown, Eric Davis, Starhawk, Peter Carroll, Patricia Monahan. She was a folklorist, very good writer, and on and on. There were a number of
Uh-huh.
teachers. Eventually, I taught two classes there. along with other longtime Maybe Logic participants. Um, Wilson died in 2007. Maybe Logic continued for another number of years. But after Wilson died, I'd spent all these years really, studying his work, and um, rewinding just a little bit, I'd met Bob a couple of times before, but I got to interview Bob in uh, July 24th, 2003, the day after the premiere of the documentary Maybe Logic: The Lives and Ideas of Robert Anton Wilson. It had premiered in Santa Cruz, where he was living, and I made the journey to Santa Cruz to go see it, and I was able to uh, finagle an interview with him with the help of David J. Brown, and I interviewed him July 24th, 2003. And that really became sort of the seed of this book um, eventually. And then he died in 2007. And when he died, I, made it a point to um, really write something about him. And I thought that it was going to be a book discussing his ideas. And it was that for a long time. But then it became, I needed, to construct a biographical spine for him to
Right.
then, create this book. So, but that took a long time really crafting this book. I spent many years, Lance, like really staying up all night in my kitchen, drinking coffee, staying till the sun rose, taking notes, and just trying to break through this thing. It's like a sculptor, and you have this big block of clay, and you're
Uh-huh.
just chopping away, and you have to keep throwing these blocks of clay away and just starting anew and start anew. I've, I wouldn't call them false starts, because there's nothing, everything is always has breeds, there's never any failure when you're seeking to create, but it takes a lot of work. And I spent many,
Sure.
many years just cracking away at this book.
Yeah, and writing is not an easy thing, which is why you have to send kids to school for years and years to learn how to do it. And more they come out not really knowing how to do it, and now they're just turning to AI to do it for them. But it's a tough skill to master. And you used a kind of artistic metaphor there, and it brings to mind, and you're also known as a visual artist. And you mentioned that you are engaged in some of that as well.
Correct. Yes. I I did graffiti based art. Um,
That goes along with the punk and rap
yeah, that's where it
genres.
started, and then collage, some painting, um, and I don't like speaking on what I'm working on projects right now, but I don't want to speak on it until it's ready.
Sure.
Um, but it was based on this idea of culture jamming, basically,
Mhm.
and I was very much influenced, theoretically, not just by Wilson, but also William Burroughs, who also, learned from Alfred Korzybski.
Yeah.
Burroughs was at Harvard. And, the Burroughs's phrase, language is a virus, the notion that we're always reading words and always reading, taking in this imagery, and that we're bombarded with, every word has an association uh, connected to it. And this is the whole notion of advertising and propaganda, right? That they want to associate these images and words with these meanings that they want to tell you what it is. And
Mhm.
I think that's exhausting on a nervous system. And I had a particular nervous system that I found this very exhausting. I was maybe perhaps sensitive to a lot of this stuff, and it hurts you. It hurts your ears. It's like the screeching the nails on a chalkboard. Like, another great influence for me was George Carlin, who I watched all his specials as like a kid before I could even talk. And like, uh, just and he was, of course, majorly influenced by Robert Anton Wilson. So, I mean, it's all there. The gang's all there. And
Uh-huh.
so I just, when it came time to say the art that I was interested in, it's sort of, an anti-art movement as well, and also like this kind of agitprop, the use of propaganda to because Wilson, of course, he's a trickster in the sense that you have to use you have to use the medium that propaganda is used for. You have to use language and imagery, but you subvert and invert meanings and adding irony and causing a semantic pause, hopefully, uh, uh, to illustrate that the Stroop test, that psychological
Yeah.
test that then Wilson utilized in his work, where people were handed the card and it's what the word red, but in the color blue, and the scientists are trying to figure out, basically the semantic pause that people have, and how that's
Yeah.
healthy for people, and that's
I
what I
just
wanted to do.
actually did that Stroop test. I was one of the things I just did yesterday with my course on language and consciousness.
Oh, that's great to hear. I love that stuff. I really
Yeah.
do. Bob exposed me to that. He put that in Illuminatus, basically. The character
Mhm.
Hagbar Celine will hand a card to someone, and it would essentially cause
Yeah.
that. And for him, it was he called it like a mini Satori, or a Zen awakening moment. But of course, this is all part of that semantic pause, like where
Yeah.
you're able to just, right. And so I wanted
And
my art to reflect that. And so this was the intention, and you have to develop your craft and skills. So um, I'm much better with words than I am with mimetic drawing and whatnot. So I just did a lot of stencil art, a lot of posters, um, and it was in the graffiti realm, meaning this wasn't sanctioned. These were these were stencils of phrases, uh,
mhm.
like like say squat the condos, which was this whole notion of when the 2008 housing crisis really hit, and why were there so many unoccupied apartments in New York City, luxury condo apartments. Oh, it just so happened that these super rich real estate developers were holding on to them as an investment, and they don't really care about New Yorkers who just
Well,
got this.
yeah, and they built all these super high-rise buildings just so these rich people who never come here can have an apartment. It's
I would I was
pretty
upset by that.
infuriating.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was very, so I made this album called Squat the Condos, and it was sort of like a concept album all about, I mean, that's hip hop, living in a city that is getting increasingly more and more expensive, and, the
Mhm.
war on the little guy, and you got to fight back. And it was all that. It was very, like a very sort of activist chant, sort of hip hop,
Yeah.
album. Um, and so I would go around, like, putting stencils up on luxury condos, squat the condos, like with graffiti. And this was illegal, and it was vandalism, and I got arrested for it uh, during the video shoot. Um, and it was funny trying to explain that to the lawyer, like, why are you here? Well, sir, I'm an artist, and I was.
Well,
um,
it sort of brings to mind Marshall McLuhan, who viewed art as an anti-environment, way to make our everyday environment, which it tends to be an invisible environment, to make that visible through art. So that makes a lot of sense. Just one more thing about your story is why did you wind up in California then, since you're such a good New York boy?
I got priced out, Lance. New York became too expensive, man. I never really wanted to leave New York, to be honest. Um, well, that's not totally honest. Of course, New York is sort of like an abusive relationship. You love it and you hate it. Um, it's great to get different perspectives. I love traveling, but yeah, I absolutely love New York. But it was a combination of that, and um, as life, the vicissitudes of life, I sort of felt like I had to leave. And I, I left when I was younger, and I lived in Hawaii for a few years. And then, as I said, I went back, but then
Right.
went back to Hawaii with my girlfriend, the off-camera producer, the semiotic alchemist. Uh, and we lived out there for 18 months in some artist housing, um, which was like such an interesting experience. And I also, act a little bit. I really don't try to put this out there too much, but I actually appeared on a TV show. I auditioned for a TV show in Hawaii before I went out there because I had developed through previous auditions. I'd known a casting director out there for that TV show Hawaii 5 and
Hmm.
I got a role. I landed a role out there on a on an episode. It was a season finale of season 9 of Hawaii 5
I take it
Direct.
this was the reboot of the original,
It was, and it
because
was.
I remember the original.
I do too because it was my dad's favorite show,
Uh,
and he loved that beginning, and like so many people, he would say the phrase over and over again, "Book 'em, Dano," and uh, yeah, so that was kind of special because I was, I had, again, this is the privilege and beauty of being in New York City is you're in the greatest acting epicenter of America, I believe. And I'd never really started out doing acting, but through the hip hop scene, there were some MCs who were also actors. So for instance, some of the guys that I knew, they went on to be in that show Hamilton. Like they created
mm,
that and were like major characters. And so I was like, oh wow, you could do that. Okay, I'm gonna try this thing. And and I'd always had an interest in acting. There was no one ever in my family. I didn't know how to do it or anything like that. And those things started just organically happened again. I started doing background acting, and there's plenty of that in New York. And then learned and went to acting school in New York City and learned at this place called the Win Hanman Institute. And Win was like a legendary wizard of a teacher. And I learned from his protege, a man named Billy Lyons, who is a acting teacher right now. And he's great, great acting teacher. I just want to
mm.
shout him out. He actually directed a documentary about Win Hammond that might still be on Netflix. I think it's called It Takes a Lunatic. And Win Hammond is a real wizard. So I don't speak about that much, Lance. That's sort of the esoteric,
Uh-huh.
you got me speaking on my esoteric craft, because I find acting to be very magical. And so I was finally able to prove my chops. And the episode was directed by Peter Weller,
Oh,
RoboCop,
hmm.
and also, fine art critic. And he was,
Also Buckaroo Banzai.
yeah, oh yeah, what a great movie. Oh, what a great movie. Um, I learned about that movie through Robert Anton Wilson, through um
Wherever you go, there you are.
um I tried talking to Weller between setups, but he was a run and gun type of guy. Like it was total chaos around him and he was like, yeah, yeah, yeah. And I tried to say, like, oh, you were so great as Bill Lee in a Naked Lunch, right? And but it was nice though. I could see at the end of the day, he was really cool. Like he was like, "Hey, everyone, give this guy an applause." And they do that for actors sometimes. They'll applaud for the actor.
Mhm.
And I just thought that was very nice. So I thought he was pretty cool. And so perhaps that brought me to Hawaii to be on that show. And the interesting irony of all these things is it was filmed in a building in downtown Hawaii, which a number of months later, I got a job as an overnight security guard, and I was stationed in that same building that I had worked in, and that kind of blew my mind a bit. The contrast of I got paid more for like 6 hours of work in that one building for that one day of work than like 2 weeks of the
Uh-huh.
security guard job. So as it is, as it goes. And so it was kind of like during those nights walking around that building and just being like, man, I gotta go for it. let's take a trip to Los Angeles and see what happens. And did that, and that was a few years ago. And went back to school during COVID with my girlfriend. We're both finishing our degrees, and then finished the book. Uh, Finished Chapel Perilous, The Life and Thought Crimes of Robert Anton Wilson. And the book is self-published, so really being hands-on, involved in every step of the way.
Mhm.
That it really took everything, every other kind of artistic venture that I love, from music, even the acting, everything went on pause to really like single focused, just focus on this book and make this the absolute best product that I can make it, the best
Uh-huh.
artifact that I can make it, and craft it as I put everything into it.
Yeah. Well, and it shows. It's really wonderful. And I note that you mentioned Doug Rushkoff, who's a friend of ours, and uh, and that he did a foreword for the book along with Grant Morrison, a well-known comics writer, among other things. Uh, so and Rushkoff, I remember Rushkoff telling me that he actually went to the Korzybski lecture that Robert Anton Wilson gave, uh, which was before my time with the Institute, but I think it was 97 when Wilson gave that lecture.
Yeah, that was a nice story that Doug tells about that. And I believe it was him, Richard Metzger, and Parker Posey, the actress, the awesome actress, and well, someone else. And they were in the front row, and Arlen was there, Bob's wife, and that was a big moment for Bob too, because it was roughly 40 years earlier that he was that's when he met Arlen, when he was going to give a practice speech lecture
Mhm.
for the Institute of General Semantics in New York. Um, Arlen was also involved in the organization separately before her and Bob met. And it was because of the New York General Semantics Society that Bob and Arlen met. Um, and I didn't really get a chance to put this in the book, but I have in the book that Bob's first two articles that were published in 1959. One was for an article for the Realist, another one was for a James Joyce review. But there was another small article that Bob wrote. It was a one-page sort of blurb, if you will, but it was for the Institute of General Semantics newsletter. And it was
Mhm.
about, he was applying like basically time stamping uh, to a marriage. And this was kind of like Bob's marriage vows, because he married Arlen in 1959. So, and they were happily married for the rest of her life and his life. And uh, but it was really beautiful, because it's like, here was Bob, like in his really analytical computer mind, vowing to love this person by accepting prehensively that she's going to change and that they're going to change. And so many people get stuck on that. They get an idealistic image of a partner in their mind, and they get so upset and rattled when the real person is different than
Mhm.
the ideal person. And
Right.
and then like Bob was already like so wise. He's like, this ideal image that I have of this woman right now, we're in this honeymoon period. That's going to change. And I still love her. And like, I think that's really beautiful. And um, so they met because of General Semantics. And then fast forward 1997 or 98, I believe it's 97. Yeah. Bob is speaking in New York, and Rushkoff is there. Richard Metzger is there. And they both received the message from Bob. I interviewed them both a lot for my book. I did not get a chance to speak with Parker Posey. I wonder what her views on Bob, if she reads a lot of Wilson. I'm not
Uh-huh.
sure. I think she just kind of went because they're all hanging out and it was a spontaneous thing, maybe. But who knows? Who knows?
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I mean, those are just great moments. And of course, a few years later, Richard Metzger hosts the DeSinfo conference, and he has Robert Anton Wilson speak as the headline performer. at the Hammerstein Ballroom in New York City. And I was there. I took the Long Island Railroad that day. It was a cold February day. Um, and I had an absolute blast. And that's where I met Rushkoff for the first time. And that's where I, met Grant Morrison for the first time after hearing them both speak and being like, "Yo, who are these guys?" And saw so many wild and amazing things that day. Joe Coleman uh, had the artist and prankster at the end of his speech. He lit his chest on fire, but beneath his shirt there was a baking sheet and a row of Roman candles that then shot out into the crowd like rocket launchers. And Hammerstein Ballroom, no less, and smoke rising, and he disappeared off stage in a plume of smoke and a maniacal smile, and then Kembra Falva came on, and she was like a really wild punk rock, kind of what is it, like surf rock sort of art performance piece, and that made everyone crazy. And then old Bob came on the stage, as they say in the biz, like it was wet, it was hot, right? Like, and it was a party. Like I've never been to like a conference. It was more like a rock concert than a conference. And hats off to Richard Metzger for and the whole Disinfo crew for making that happen. It's become a legendary event. And I'm amazed that I was there, but Robert Anton Wilson brought me there, but it was there that then I was introduced to the work of Rushkoff and Morrison. And then over the years, I, developed a friendship with Doug, and then years later with Grant. And it's just really interesting how, the roots, the slow roots of all these things, well, a network, an organic
Yeah.
network is there,
Yeah, networks are fascinating to really trace through all the interconnections, and there's so many in your book. That's what I really loved about it. But perhaps a central question that we should address is Robert Anton Wilson. I mean, you described him as a philosopher, certainly very much a writer with having published many books and lots of articles, and really pursued a living to a large extent as a writer. And Korzybski in General Semantics comes up many times through the book. And how would you describe the influence of Korzybski and of General Semantics on Wilson? And what could you tell us for our listeners? Presumably, I always wonder who the hell is listening to this anyway. But I think it's a good bet that at least some of them are interested in general semantics, since we are the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. So, and what's the connection there? What did general semantics mean to Wilson?
Oh, heck yeah. And that's the great thing about this media is it may not feel like people are listening right now, but I mean, and Bob often felt like people weren't listening, and now here we are, Korzybski's influence on Wilson, his philosophical outlook, it can't be understated. It's pretty monumental. It's a pretty huge influence. Bob first discovered science and sanity at the age of 16 in 1948 when he was roving the stacks of Brooklyn Public Library, just looking at all the amazing books, and he came across the binding of a big doorstopper of a book, an 800-page, behemoth of a book full of complex jargonized words, and this Polish count telling people how he wants to make language like calculus, and Bob loved it. He ate it up. He read in the introduction. The book answered the question for him: what is reality? And the answer was that there are many realities, really. There's reality, and there's all these interpretations of reality, which we can't even really describe, because as Korzybski said, like whatever you say it is, it isn't.
Hmm.
And this also was a very sort of beatnik jazz type of hepcat sort of, way, the use of language. I mean, there's been books dedicated to this notion of hip, uh, and hip is to know, but hip is to know that the map is not the territory. You're hip to the what did Korzybski call it? The silent levels of experience. You're hip to the vibe. You're hip to the all that kind of wild countercultural talk, right? That these musicians sort of used. I think Korzybski was seeking to kind of capture that essence in his words. The fact that, well, so Bob read this answer, what is reality, and he learned about multi-ordinality and these other aspects, or key points that Korzybski was making with this book. Especially his most famous phrase, "The map is not the territory," which coincided with "whatever you say it is, it isn't." And this just clicked for Bob. And I mean, it's what's great about Bob is that, like, his message is there too, and you'll see the influence of Korzybski. His message is there in his very first article for the Realist, published in 1959, an article called "The Semantics of God," which essentially it's satirical, and it's a questioning the genderized notion of God, and saying we can't apply any human attribute to God. God completely transcends whatever we describe. Whatever we say God is, it isn't. And
Hmm.
and of course, Bob was also influenced by Taoism and Joyce, and he was able to just synthesize all these things together, because Taoism is similar too. It's you can't really you can't really speak the truth. You can only embody the truth in a sense, right? And so. Um, let's see here, Bob. So he is it's so deeply ingrained in him. He said that he read uh, Science and Sanity at the age of 16 in 1948 in a weekend. Right at the age of 16, I read One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in a weekend at like 19, and I thought I was pretty smart. And, uh, so, and then he said he continued to reread the book every year for the rest of his life. So that's a that's a very influential text, for Bob. And he also read Korzybski's earlier book too, Manhood of Humanity, was very influenced by it. And as I said, he was an early member of the Institute of General Semantics in New York, when he lived in New York in the late 50s as well. So, um, Bob was, yeah, heavily influenced by Korzybski, heavily influenced.
Well, I'm sure he'd be happy to know that about less than a year and a half ago, we published the sixth edition of Science and Sanity. Um, but wow, it's very interesting too, and I think there were some frustrations as well. I remember coming across a letter where he was complaining that his book Quantum Psychology was not being reviewed in etc. And you know, so it may be that at least some folks found him a little bit too hip. It's hard to think of general semantics in some circles as being very hip, but it did connect to aspects of the counterculture and the human potential movement and all of that.
Oh, for sure. I mean, it is interesting how, a message is received through, just say different encampments, if you will, or where people go with the message. Because, um, I mean, it's hip. General semantics is hip in the sense that Bob picked it up, and then but so did Burroughs, who is,
Mhm.
he's one of the godfathers of the beats, and then also godfathers of punk rock. I mean, that's
Yeah.
counterculture there, and
Yeah, I was really taken that I didn't realize I wasn't aware of their relationship, and of course Burroughs actually studied with Korzybski at like they used to have he used to do seminars which we just brought back a couple of years ago, like in-person seminars as well. Like we're going to have one in Mexico City in June coming up. We had one in London last year and New York the year before. But you know that William S. Burroughs and Robert Anton Wilson were both, they must have bonded in some ways over general semantics.
Yeah, I would think so. Um, I mean, Bob was a big fan of Naked Lunch. Uh, and he, for the reason that, same reason why Dorothy Parker and Norman Mailer were big fans. Like they recognized that what Burroughs was doing with language itself was revolutionary and important, especially, when it manifested in Naked Lunch isn't like a what pure cut up novel, right? It's kind of like this mashup together, but his later cut up novels and the whole cut up technique that Burroughs and Brian Geisen developed, um, how that's completely influenced, at least Burroughs' side, by Korzybski and Cubism and the artistic movement of Cubism, because it's seeking to present all these different sides at one time. And
Mm-hmm.
like how John Coltrane tried to play, what did he call it, like all these notes at the same time, not tried, how he played all these notes at the same time. And this new ability that's reflected in, this is a bit of a tangent, but it's reflected in the technology of the 20th century. And then you have these really innovative artists who are seeking to reflect our language, or use our language to reflect that technology. So beginning in the early 20th century, from Ezra Pound and James Joyce, and the birth of the collage, but not just the collage, excuse me, the montage
Mm-hmm.
technique in film. And then what impact does looking at visual montage have on our psychology? It's all about where Burroughs took it and where he took the cut up method. It's all about breaking these associations and being aware of how we words hook onto us. That's why language is a virus, and when we hook associations onto words and images. And Bob was doing the same thing, of course, and doing a couple other things, but through his flavor, through his stoner intellectualism, if you will. And Burroughs was doing it through his kind of you know gothic or film noir flavor. You know, and Philip K. Dick was representing things in
Yeah.
his own way too. Where this notion of utilizing alien invasion to uproot this idea of like certainty and ontological reality. And Bob's doing it with paranoia in Illuminatus trilogy, and Burroughs is
Mhm.
doing it through this grotesque body horror and whatnot. But the underlying thing for me, I think, is all there. This observing this dissolution of physical reality right in front of your face. And so what's really being dissolved, though, is it reality itself, or is it these perceptions that were formed by these old maps like Aristotelian either or logic? We're completely entrenched politically and in the media now, even more than ever. Like we have these great internet technologies, and people have become stupider in some ways, like even more entrenched in either or outrage and hate. And it's really sad, like where people are at in a lot of ways. And of course, there's more great things happening than ever before too, but I think Wilson's work is so important right now because it might help a few people extricate themselves from the fallacy of the is of identity. Because it's so quick to people are making more hasty generalizations than ever before, it seems. And that itself might be a hasty generalization. But I could walk outside this door and meet, very kind people. But it's very interesting. Like I think Wilson's work is great to read right now, because it is like Marshall McLuhan. He is
Who
aware of
was an influence on Wilson as well. So
major influence.
and
Yeah.
and also very much had written about Joyce, very much influenced by Joyce and Pound and many of those things. And actually, McLuhan was aware of Korzybski and mentioned him favorably in his doctoral dissertation.
That makes complete sense.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
it's
nice to hear that.
all fits together. And you mentioned Philip K. Dick, who also it's less direct, but shows an influence from general semantics. I think partly through Wilson.
I could see that.
Yeah. And
Yeah, I'm
so there were other science fiction writers. I'm never sure how to say his name, but A.E. Van Vogt, V-O-G-T. And I think that Philip K. Dick got some of that from him as well.
oh wow.
Um, and then you may know, I mean, Frank Herbert was another through Hayakawa, the
Wow.
Dune author, and it was Robert Heinlein who was another follower of Korzybski.
I knew about Heinlein. I didn't know about Frank Herbert.
Yeah, he worked with Hayakawa
Mm.
in your neck of the woods in California.
Oh, this is great. This is great to learn. Yeah, that I mean, general semantics is sort of like Bob, right? Like the influence is it's there and it's prevalent, but
Mhm.
it's often not really acknowledged. Although I mean it has been, but I mean it's not
It,
put out
yeah,
much.
yeah, not nowhere near enough, considering the extent of its influence. And another important figure that comes up in your book is Gregory Bateson. Uh, Also someone influenced by general semantics, and also someone who did one of our Alfred Korzybski memorial lectures.
Mhm. Yeah, his is a great mind, and uh, I must say, Steps to an Ecology of the Mind, a little difficult to read, but I mean, I think the one, of course, he's known for so many ideas, but the idea of the double bind theory
Mhm.
is one that was you know I don't know, shown to me, I guess, in Wilson's Prometheus Rising. And I mean, it's brilliant the way that Bateson is able to sort of, yeah, as he says, an ecology of the mind, and then
Yeah,
what is the mind? It's pretty amazing.
yeah, yeah. And it also hooks into cybernetics, which comes up as well.
Yeah, Bob's unwritten masterpiece is a book that he was working on called The Tale of the Tribe. And it was the title comes from an Ezra Pound quote, or even an Ezra. It could be from the Cantos. I'm not sure, but yeah, it could be the Cantos. Or no, someone once asked Ezra Pound, "What is the Cantos?" And he said, "It's a tale of the tribe." And Wilson is brilliant at pastiche and also, we'll just say remixing, right? Sampling, right?
Yeah,
So he samples that phrase "tale of the tribe" and applies it, well, Ezra Pound, I guess, meant it too. Humanity, it's us. We are the tribe. We have to figure this out, all of us. We are one tribe. Uh, and this is extremely difficult to get to this point of understanding, but uh, an understanding of language is absolutely essential to get there, according to Wilson, because with this understanding of language, there's an understanding of communication, and with that, negotiation. And we have to learn how to negotiate because we have systems, organisms as a whole interacting with environments. And these organisms experience things like hunger and the need for water and clean water. And we have to learn not to fight over resources, but to properly negotiate these things. And it's reading Wilson. I thought that humanity was on the way there. Pretty soon, we're going to get there. Clean water and food for everyone, housing for everyone. But I don't know
uh,
where we're at the moment.
it's yes, but maybe to just get a couple of quick takes on a couple of more names that come up in your book. One early on, H.P. Lovecraft.
Yes, yeah, big influence on Bob. Lovecraft, Wilson read a lot of him. He discovered him in a science fiction magazine. I think it was called Amazing Tales when he was around 13. And Lovecraft, of course, sort of what Bob picked up from him is that he creates this world of these old gods that are older and more terrible than we could even conceive, and they're so like large and powerful and indifferent to humanity, and they'll just meddle in humanity whenever they feel like it, and there's really not a lot of benevolent love there. um, and Wilson really read a lot of Lovecraft, say like in his late teens and early 20s, when he was going through that sort of angsty, existential angst, phase, if you will. And um, but he really gained a lot of jewels from him, though, like in terms of the imagery and this idea of like a pyramid rising from the oceans, and the idea of the Yog Sagoth, who is this terrible, horrible creature god. And of course, Yog Sagoth makes an appearance in the Illuminatus trilogy, and as does Cthulhu, the great Cthulhu mythos. And yeah, I mean, so many people have been influenced by Lovecraft, especially in recent years, because the imagery is so rich and scary.
Yeah.
And of course, yeah, well, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay. And a couple more names. I mean, I know John Lilly, who was, part of a network that also included Bates and other folks. But the one who really comes up a lot is Timothy Leary.
Yes. Tim Leary was probably Wilson's longest running intellectual collaborator. Um, Bob first met Leary in 1964 when he interviewed him for the Realist magazine in an article that was called Leary's Psychological H-Bomb. Bob was immediately intrigued and interested in Leary's approach to psychology, which was based in group psychology and the work of Henry Stack Sullivan, and studying group dynamics, but then also game theory and what Leary called post-Einsteinian physics, or just basically quantum physics. Leary wanted to view group dynamics in a quantum physics perspective, and this is where psychedelics came in. He believed that psychedelics were a good tool to further analyze, basically the notion of self. So yeah, Wilson thought Leary was absolutely brilliant. And he was a supporter of his ideas. But then when Leary went to prison, Leary was arrested in 1969 and given 37 years in prison for possession of a small amount of marijuana. The judge called him the most dangerous man in America. Leary thought otherwise, and Leary broke out of prison with the help of the Weather Underground, and ended up in Africa hanging out with Eldridge Cleaver and some Black Panthers out there. And he had a whole adventure, but then he was arrested in 1973 in Afghanistan and re-imprisoned. So from 1973 to 1976, Robert Anton Wilson was like a constant sort of a pen pal and visitor for Leary. And it was during that time that Leary asked Bob to collaborate with him on his book, The Periodic Table of Energy, which then basically becomes the Eighth Circuit model of intelligence that Wilson and Leary are most known for. And when Leary is freed from prison in 1976, Bob is a friend, a true friend. He's helping get Leary publishing deals with book deals with different publishers, and they start going on tour together. They hit the road together, and during the 80s, they become like the Cheech and Chong of the tour circuit. They're a duo, and they click. They're good friends. And then they also have this, they have so many things in common too, like they're kindred spirits. They're both these kind of Irish American rebels, but they also have children. Wilson had his son Graham, who was afflicted with schizophrenia, and Leary had his daughter Susan, who had schizophrenia, and she sadly killed herself. She had a very tragic life. And Leary hardly ever talks about that, and I know, but he felt very deeply about his children, and I would imagine, I don't know, but they could have had some heart to hearts about, you know, even if they didn't, they still shared this thing of they have children who are schizophrenic. Um,
Well, and
and
also Wilson lost his daughter.
and then Wilson,
You know.
yes, his daughter Luna was murdered at the age of 15, and that tragedy was the spark that really launched Graham, his son's schizophrenic breakdown, because they were so close, Luna and Graham. Very, very tragic. This isn't, the major tragedy of Bob's life and the whole family's life. And I really sought to illustrate that in the book that, Wilson is a hero by the simple fact that he endured this pain, and he kept working. He utilized his art as a true therapy in the Nietzschean sense, where that's what art is for. It's not for any other reason. Art is for the therapeutic nature for the artist and for the viewers. However, there must be a craft to it. It has to be good, right? There must be an aesthetic craft. Can't just run in place and call that performance art, although that's done more and more these days. But so yeah, Wilson really utilized his writing to heal himself when he was broke, didn't have a lot of resources, and I think that is one element of the book that I really seek to put in there, that you don't even need to know who Robert Anton Wilson is or what he did to pick up my book and to read it and enjoy it, because it's in that book that you will learn about this extraordinary person. And
Mhm.
and what's one of the most extraordinary things about Bob is that he reflects the fact that there are so many people, everyday heroes out there, heroes and heroines who just are walking their lives and handling it, heroically. Doesn't need to be a huge grand gesture of heroism. It's just showing up.
Uh-huh.
That's heroic enough,
Yeah.
you know? And I really wanted to put that in there. And I think people will get something from that.
I have to say, I wonder, when I read about, and I would totally second what you've said about the book, is a great entry into learning about Robert Anton Wilson. And as you described him politically as a leftist libertarian, I think, and it occurs to me that an anarchist, and that a lot of folks, when they especially think about that kind of view, that it seems to have migrated over to the right wing in our time, in the 21st century. And what do you think he would be? What do you think he would be saying? Where do you think he would be positioning himself today? If he were with us still.
Well, I of course can only base this on and extrapolate where he was towards the end of his life, which I mean, I think Wilson was the most raw at the end when he was an old man and did not give an F. uh, he let the F bombs fly in his talks and had such a ribald sense of humor, yet really was not that offensive, for being a provocateur, which I think a lot of quote unquote provocateurs lack these days. So where Bob was at the end of his life, well, I put in my book that in one of his last interviews, it was a series called Robert Anton Wilson Explains Everything, or Old Bob Exposes His Ignorance. And an interview from his later part of his life, I should say, not one of his last interviews, but he was asked on a scale of 1 to 10, what's one quote unquote conspiracy theory or theory that you think is almost certainly true? And this was in 2001. And he said that he believes that America is an oligarchy. Um,
Wow.
and here we are today. Bernie
Yeah.
Sanders, I mean, the word, it's a brolyarchy, right? Um,
Right.
but it isn't suddenly an oligarchy today. It's just people are getting hip to it today in a way. We've reached a new phase of it. Wilson, his take that calling it an oligarchy would coincide with, and I put this in the book, A later 2014 study conducted by some political scientists out of Princeton, I think, that basically looked at policy decisions of the last 40 years in America since the 1980s, and have determined that large money groups, have way more influence over everyday citizens in political policy in America since at least the 1980s. Therefore, this is an oligarchy. We don't live in a representative democracy. And like, this is a harsh pill to swallow. Like George Carlin said, you don't have any rights. You don't have any rights. And what does that mean? It means, like the Beastie Boys said, you have to fight for your right to party. You have to fight, you have to stand up. You have to make yourself heard. You have to elbow your way in. You have to get loud. And Wilson was very aware of that. He may have wrote about the Dalai Lama in Illuminatus trilogy of some guy, standing in the middle of nowhere, doesn't want to get involved. But, Hagbar Celine knew that we're here in this real time. You can't be neutral on a moving train, to bring in another quote like from Howard Zinn. So Wilson, I think, would just emphasize an activism that's really tethered to really doing true knowledge about a situation. So much activism, sadly, is based on emotional reactions. People don't take a semantic pause. I mean, that's not to disparage a lot of activism. There's some types of activism, especially what we see perhaps today, it just seems like tools of propaganda, right? And of course, people have their interpretations of what they think about certain demonstrations only by looking at it through a TV screen. Like I was at a number of Occupy encampments when that happened, like a lot. I was in an interesting place in my life. I was able to go to all these different Occupy encampments. And then, coming back and later discussing Occupy with some family and friends, and people who were not even there had all these opinions about it and what they thought was really going on. And it's like, well, if we were testifying in a court, my word would hold more than yours because I'm an eyewitness, but you're just basing it off of secondary sources. So my point being, like, Wilson he was all about this. Like, you have to educate yourself first in order to know how to make a sound decision. And he just happened to believe his sound decisions coincided with what would be termed left libertarianism. That was sort of a popular phrase, like maybe in the aughts, in the early 2000s. There was a test you could take on the internet that would place you like on the spectrum of, the left-right axis and where you fit, right? And there was, so it's libertarian or authoritarian, socialist, or no, right or left, right? And so Wilson, of course, is a libertarian. He wants, increased civil rights for everyone, but he understands like the notion or the importance of like, we'll just call it collective bargaining. He understands that one cannot truly be free if you're surrounded by people who are not free themselves. That's not real freedom. That's the, as Hegel talked about, the master-slave dynamic. To really achieve freedom, you have to be able to maximize your own individual capacities while helping others maximize theirs. So he settled on this phrase, toward the end of his life, non-Euclidean. He sincerely wanted,
which comes from Korzybski, right? Well, I mean, it goes back to Einstein and Einstein's revolution in physics was non-Newtonian physics, but it incorporated non-Euclidean geometry.
I love it. Yes, completely. Yeah. And of course, like Einstein, he implemented that in a way, I guess, by hyphenating space and time, right? Like, space was curved. And so this was Wilson's work, was that, we create these false dichotomies that don't exist. For instance, the fact, the mind-body dichotomy, it's a continuum that's completely in feedback with each other. There's no split between the mind and the body. Just like we are a product of nature. Everything we do is nature. There's no unnatural anything. There are just things that are, work better at certain times than others, if you will, right? And so this being Wilson's approach and then applying this, politically and what he would think today. I mean, he was on record of calling Trump totally crazy, a complete nut job. I don't think his opinion would change. Wilson's from New York. I think there's a certain the people who believe they see through Trump from New York. I think they see it at the root. It's like, you didn't pay your workers. What are you talking about? Point
Yeah.
blank. You didn't pay the workers that built your thing. You tried to put these young black teenagers to death. You took out an ad in a New York newspaper calling for the death penalty of 5 innocent young men. That's who you are. I think Bob saw that about Trump. So I don't think he would be on the MAGA train. However, he was full of surprises and he was a provocateur. But where he was always seeking to go would be to figure out a way to transcend your own entrenchment. Understand that there are emotional components as to why you might consider yourself a leftist or why you might consider yourself a conservative, and really gain this knowledge of self. Maybe you were raised by people who were socialists, or you were raised by a hyper capitalist family, but understand this component as to why you believe this way. So that's a very long-winded answer for Wilson's take that he sought to apply, called non-Euclidean. However, when he voted at times, like so in 1992 he voted for Bill Clinton. So he was on record as being a Democrat there, but he considered it a huge mistake after a few years of Clinton being in office. And then when it came to the 2000 elections, I don't know if he voted for Ralph Nader, but he called Bush and Gore the two lying bastards. And Wilson was really able to really start pulling back the veil of politicians. I mean, he always was able to do this. This is pointing out the propaganda. So what he directed his readers to was, look at the donors of the presidents. These are the people who are going to have their needs met before you.
Yeah.
And that's a cynical take, but
yeah. No, it's all very interesting and important, sobering stuff as well, but also in some ways inspiring. I think, for general semanticists who want to learn more about Robert Anton Wilson or want to actually delve into his work, I mean, for me, I would recommend quantum psychology as an entree, but what would you say would be the place to start?
I agree. I think quantum psychology is a fantastic book.
And for folks who just want, who are maybe just want to get the best of him, what would you recommend?
If it's just one book,
Yeah.
Prometheus Rising.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. In that book, he goes through the 8th circuit model of intelligence, which is pretty central to his, philosophy, if you will.
Right. And for folks who really want to get an introduction to Robert Anton Wilson's life and times, and as you put it, thought crimes, I think Chapel Perilous, your book by Gabriel Kennedy, would be the place to start to get that great overview. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh, most certainly, Lance. 100%.
Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. I've really enjoyed it, and I thank you so much for being a part of it.
Thank you, Lance. Thank you for having me here. I enjoyed it very much as well.
You've been listening to our February 2025 episode of Semantic Reactions, featuring Gabriel Kennedy, aka Prop Anon. If you like what you've heard, or even if you haven't, please consider becoming a member of the Institute of General Semantics, if you're not one already. In addition to supporting our efforts, IGS members receive an annual subscription to our journal, etc., a review of general semantics, access to our online and in-person events, lectures, and seminars, and discounts on the books and audiovisual materials that we sell. Regular membership is only $50 and half off for students. Your membership and any additional donations you care to make will help to support our offerings and activities as we work to bring a measure of sanity to the world. The Institute of General Semantics is a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to research and education on a wide range of topics. They include language and symbols, meaning and perception, communication and representation, media and technology, science and epistemology, creativity, and critical thinking. We are dedicated to making the world a better place through practical strategies for improving our semantic environment, individually and collectively. For more information about the Institute and our activities, and to become a member and supporter of our work, please visit our website at generalsemantics.org. That's generalsemantics, one word, .org. And this brings to a close our 30th episode of Semantic Reactions, the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. This is Ben Houck, signing off, saying, we hope you'll join us next time. And until then, just remember this simple fact, that the map is not the territory.